Great. Well done, everybody. We'll just give it a couple of moments while people join. It takes a while sometimes everyone to join in. People sometimes get lost in cyberspace between these main rooms and breakout rooms. Someone wave so I know you can hear me. Great. Thank you very much. Simple things. All very disciplined with your microphones on mute and so on. Well done, everybody. If you can keep your microphones on mute, that will help us with background noise and all the rest of it. But don't let the fact that you're on mute stop you from unmuting and interrupting. That will be a good interruption, as we know from the life of Jesus, is worth everything. So don't hesitate to unmute and interrupt with a thought or a question, or perhaps if you'd rather, if you're too polite, then just add your question as we go in the chat, and then that will help me. I'll either try and pick that question up as I talk, or we can come back to it at the end. I'll try and finish with 10 minutes to go before we 10 minutes to go before the end, so that we can ask questions. Okay, people are still, just a few people just still adding. I'm assuming that we're all here now. If you could pop yourself on mute, that would be really great, and we'll get underway. Becoming a disciple who makes disciples. Becoming a disciple who makes disciples. Pause for a moment just to get your mind in the space. You've probably been full of thoughts and ideas all day, so I'm sorry to add a few more ideas to your brain this afternoon. It is that graveyard slot, isn't it, after lunch? So we'll push through for 35 minutes together. Disciples, not the church, make disciples. Do you agree? Disagree? Make you think about, is your church making disciples? Disciples, not the church, make disciples. Don't want to get into a theological discussion, but arguably if the church began on the day of Pentecost, Jesus told the disciples to begin to go, Jesus introduced them to the disciple-making process before that. But the church is made up of disciples, but it's the disciples, not the church, that make disciples. Do you agree or disagree? I'd encourage you to reflect on that statement beyond the time that we've got just now. I want to share 5 ideas, 5 thoughts about disciples making disciples. And if these ideas are new to you, it will be somewhat overwhelming. So in the same way that the circus plate spinner learned to spin 1 plate before they learned to spin 2 or 3 or even 5, I want to encourage you to think about the idea that most resonates with you, and to hold on to that and to dig a little deep with that idea, rather than worrying about all 5 and getting lost in the detail of it all. So I encourage you now to remember at the end, okay, which of these 5 was really kind of touching me, digging at me as I was listening, that I need to go back to and think a bit more about. Okay, the first of those ideas is this, a new mindset. We know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And we know we're supposed to do what Jesus would do. We wear bracelets. What would Jesus do? In fact, some of us might have worn bracelets. What would Jesus do? It's no longer in vogue, is it? And we know that being a Christian is to live like Jesus. And yet, I'm more aware that what we spend our time doing in church can be less the way of Jesus than we thought it was or wish it was. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I've been in church leadership for 35 years. I've given the best energies of my life into church leadership. And what I'm sharing with you is something that I'm wrestling with, a journey that I'm on, that my church is on. And so this is an inside chat amongst friends, rather than someone from the outside pointing out where we're going wrong. This is as much where I think I've gone wrong, where I've lost my way and are trying to recalibrate and recover myself. Now, let me understand let me give some examples about what I mean by this, a new mindset, the way of Jesus. What Jesus didn't do. Jesus didn't draw bigger and bigger crowds. But if you have any conversation about church for a nanosecond, we usually want to know how many people came. And we love the idea that more people might come. And if more people come, then surely that's a bigger success than if less people come. And so we're fixated by bigger and bigger crowds. But Jesus often ran away from the crowds, sent the crowds away, got the disciples to try and give them something to eat, and disappeared from the crowds, regarded them as having the wrong agenda and getting in the way of what he was trying to do. Jesus had a very ambivalent relationship with crowds, whereas we seem to love them, the bigger, the better. Jesus didn't run any events and programs, but if your church is typical, most of your best people are busy running events and programs, because that's what we put good Christians to work at, running events and programs. And we seek to get people in. So often we'll talk about, maybe if people come to this, then we can get them into church for that. They come to church on Tuesday for something, maybe we can get them into church on a Sunday for something different. Our mindset is that this is an advert for that, and that is trying to get them in some way. And so we spend a lot of time in church. And ironically, the more you follow a sense of calling in our traditional church understanding and become involved in the church, you spend more and more time in the church and less time outside it. Whereas Jesus didn't spend much time. I'm not saying it wasn't important or part of his rhythm, but the way the Gospels are recorded, the times that Jesus was inside the church, the synagogue, well, on one occasion he got kicked out and they nearly killed him. And on a couple of other occasions, he caused the right stir. So it wasn't a great experience for Jesus inside the church. And yet we're kind of always focused about spending time in the church. And we rely on teaching alone, don't we? On a Sunday, we create a classroom experience, and we expect people to go out and live it. And it's a bit like teaching people to drive just by telling them the theory and then handing them the car keys. Christian life is a practical way of life. If you have a dog barking and you could find the mute button, that would be really brilliant. That would be great. So we concentrate on teaching. If only we give people the right information, then they'll go and do it. And Jesus concentrated on an apprenticeship model. So that's what Jesus didn't do. What Jesus did do was this. Jesus built a discipling community, a small family, a small extended family, a band of brothers and sisters that went on mission together. That's what Jesus did. That's the story of the 3 years of Jesus's ministry. He built a discipling community and they went on mission together. So we need a new mindset. And here's a thought. I'm afraid we haven't got time to pause for these questions. You will get all the notes afterwards. But could I be busy with church activities but still be missing the ways of Jesus? Yes. Could I, Simon, be a church leader and still be missing the ways of Jesus? Yes. And there is a challenge for me and maybe for you. So a new mindset, therefore, leads us to a new priority. If Jesus built a community, a family on mission, then that needs to be our priority also. There's plenty of places you can go to see this, but a very quick example is here in Luke chapter 6. Jesus spent a night up on the mountainside. His relationship with God, his up relationship, was primary. He spent a night on the mountainside. When morning came, he called together a group of people to be family with him. An oikos is the Greek word that the Bible uses, extended family. Think of the number of times the word household appears in the New Testament. That's the way the NIV translates it. This was a fundamental relational building block for what Jesus was doing with the church. He built a family and they went out on mission together. That's the way of Jesus. That was his discipling methodology, to build a family and go on mission together. And can you see, therefore, that we need a balance of all three? A balance of our connectedness with God, our building a discipling community, and us going on mission together. Now, typically in our churches, we've focused on the up and the in. We've spent a lot of time thinking about our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. That's probably familiar church. I guess most of us would recognize that. We have increasingly spent more time thinking about our out relationship. But often what we've discovered is that when we go out and we do something practical in the community, we often, or it's easier to leave God out of it. And we create something more of a social gospel dilemma. We become a group of people doing some good in the neighborhood. There are, of course, some people, and you might know who they are in your church, who are focused on they're passionate about God, and they're going out to preach the gospel and to win the world, and they've got no time for the church that they see as being self-serving, and there are wacky evangelists. We need them as well, because of course the truth is we need all three. That's the missional discipleship relationship: the up, the in, and the out. Now, typically, as individuals and as churches, we are usually strong in two and weak at the third. So in the church that I inherited, church that I lead, we are typically good at up and in and have been less developed in our out. What we're seeking to change. And maybe you can relate to that too. Maybe in your church, you've been really good at building a sense of community and reaching out, but that connectedness with God can sometimes seem weaker than perhaps you know that it should be. We need all three. And that all happens in an environment of family. Again, that Greek word oikos. Now, you would rightly understand, I think, that the triangle should be this way up, that our relationship with God comes first. And in so many ways, absolutely true. Don't want to take anything from that at all. But Jesus, when he talked about it, he prioritized something slightly different. Jesus seemed to put out as the priority, as the catalyzing factor. So at the end of the Gospels, Jesus said, go into all the world and start worship services to help people get close to me. No. Go into all the world and start Bible studies to help you grow as a community. No. Go into all the world and make disciples. Go out, prioritize out. The missional movement should be out. And I think that's because when we put out first, also get up and in. But if we prioritize one of the other relationships, we don't necessarily get the others. And my best example of this is when you go on a mission trip. Many of us will have been on a mission trip for a week, a month, or several months. When we've prioritized mission, when we've gone out on mission, but I guarantee that if you went on a mission trip, your relationship with God, your up went up. Almost certainly, you'll come back more on fire for God than when you went. The other thing that will happen when you went on a missions trip is that your relationships will have grown really deep in a short space of time. Some people will have gone on mission with others for a week or a month and started relationships that last a whole lifetime. And maybe Jesus was right by catalyzing the out. Prioritize mission, and up and in will also become part of your story. But we need a balance. We need a balance of all three. And I suggest that prioritizing mission is the way that we help keep all three in balance. And so a question: how strong is my up, my in, and my out? I'm really hoping that we'll turn this into a conversation. So get your questions going in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just keep speaking, and that'll be awful for all of us. So get your questions in the chat, and let's try and have conversations around the things that are going on in your situation, or the things that you're thinking about. So a new priority, so a new mindset, a new priority. Thirdly, then, a new lifestyle. If Jesus built family as the context for discipleship, and Jesus therefore chose 12, it is not possible for us to disciple 50, 150, 200 people in our churches. If Jesus could only do 12, who on earth do we think we are trying to disciple a lot more than that? And not only does it mean that we focus on a few in this family environment. It also means that instead of it being, I'm going to disciple people on a Sunday morning and on a Tuesday evening, which can be typically programmatic in our churches, it means that people need access to our lives. Jesus said, come follow me, come and share everything that I am doing. So it's no longer about the church or the time of our meetings. It's about opening up my life, my home, my family to those that I want to see discipled. It's a absolute kind of line in the sand against our compartmentalization of we'll do something in this moment, in that moment, and the other moment, and expect discipleship to happen. And so the New Testament is portrayed as these households, as people in small discipling communities that make up the whole church. The church in Rome, for example, when Paul greets them in Romans chapter 16, Paul effectively writes to 5 or 6 extended families, and he greets the leaders of each of those extended families that together make up the whole church. And so the beat of church life was very much extended families multiplying and coming together, rather than perhaps our beat, we're all together and we try and split off into different groups and small groups and so on and so forth. Just thanks ever so much for a couple of questions coming. At what size does an extended family dynamic in a community become untenable? I think that depends on a number of things. It depends on it depends on the size of houses and the weather. So in Mediterranean countries, extended families grow a lot bigger because they can meet outside a lot and so on. We've got smaller houses and the weather isn't so good. Scandinavian missional communities are often a lot smaller for that very reason. It depends on people's relational capacity, whether it's, and that's according to people's stage of life. There isn't a one size fits all. I think our missional community has typically been around 18 adults with children and so on added onto that. This is harder with lockdown when we can feel so isolated. Absolutely. And we could spend our time thinking about the challenges of lockdown. But just to hold it there, absolutely, lockdown has made this a lot more difficult. Although on the flip side of that, because we emphasize communities in our church, we have been able to stay relationally connected a lot better through lockdown than we would have been able to do without that. Jesus didn't run events and programs, but Inspiring Ipswich is doing both. Are we getting it wrong? No, we're not getting it wrong, George. I think there's a balance. So I'm jumping on the other end of the seesaw. We've spent all our time thinking about temple, which is big gatherings and celebration, and less time on synagogue, which is supposed to be community. And it's a redressing. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that we are against big gatherings, big celebrations. We do big gatherings and big celebrations every week as a church. We need that to sustain the communities, but nevertheless, big communities in and of themselves are not going to, I think, help build disciples in the way that we hope. I think I grew up in a church environment which taught me through college, through experience, that if we created big celebrations and we had brilliant preaching, then people would be discipled and the world will come to Christ. That's not going to happen. We need something different. And we do need the big tribal experiences to support that, but the big tribal experiences won't do that by themselves. Let's who's close enough for you to disciple? So that's back to those the levels of relationship. So a new focus. So instead of running events and programs, we need to have a new focus around raising and releasing disciples. And that's what we see Jesus doing. Jesus spent 3 years trying to raise and release disciples. And he was so successful at it that 2,000 years later, you are on a Zoom call on a Saturday afternoon instead of watching Wales beat Italy in the rugby. That's how successful Jesus was. And a little telltale as to where I think I should be this afternoon. So raising and releasing disciples. And how did Jesus do that? What was his focus? Very intentional as we look back through the Gospels. Jesus did something and he said to his disciples, come follow me, come and watch me. Come and stand by my side. Come and look over my shoulder while I do some things. Jesus did some stuff. The disciples watched and they talked about it. But slowly, but perhaps not so subtly, the emphasis began to change. Jesus did some stuff and he expected the disciples to help him. The crowd were hungry and Jesus says to the disciples, you feed them. The disciples couldn't believe it. They expected Jesus to do it all, but Jesus was saying, no, you feed them. I want you to get involved in this mission. And slowly but surely, the emphasis changed from Jesus doing it and the disciples helping to the disciples doing it and Jesus helping them. So Jesus sent them out, didn't he? Jesus said, now it's your turn. You go out and you do what I've been doing. The disciples came back overjoyed and they talked. Sometimes the disciples came back and they failed. And they asked Jesus, why couldn't we drive out that demon? What was going wrong? And Jesus was teaching them that Jesus was doing, the disciples were helping. Slowly but surely, the disciples were doing, and Jesus was helping, because the day was coming when the disciples would need to do it by themselves, and someone else would start watching. And so the journey of disciples making disciples would begin. And Jesus prioritized that over 3 years of ministry. And that's why Jesus seems to spend more and more time with the 12 as those 3 years go on, because that's where his primary investment was. Jesus didn't invest in the crowds. And one of the things, maybe this touches on what you were saying, asking about, George, one of the things that we do in our churches is that we try and invest in the crowds. Jesus didn't invest in the crowds ultimately. He preached to them for sure, but he put his best energies and investments into a small group of people so that they could then capture his DNA and go on to replicate it and to live it. And I think that's a real challenge for the emphases that we place on our leaders in churches and what we expect our events and programs to do and deliver. Jesus spent 3 years raising and releasing. What's the next step with someone you are seeking to raise up and release? What's the next step with someone you are seeking to raise up and release? Now, I'm acutely aware that I've been leading a church where people leading events and programs haven't even asked that question, because what they've been focused on is leading the event and the program. Now, I'm not against events and programs. Our church is full of events and programs. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's try and see with fresh eyes the emphasis that Jesus was bringing here. What's the next step with someone you are seeking to raise up and release? Sorry, just having a little cough. Yeah, absolutely. What Leanne is saying in the chat, the observation about child development and scaffolding and support and so on. And I think it's absolutely true that we, in a sense, maybe always need the scaffolding. So sometimes I describe church life as the events and the programs are like the trellis that support the vine. What happens though in our churches, instead of tending the vine, we spend our time tending the trellis, and we don't think about how well the vine's growing. And so it's again this kind of balance between kind of the support and structure and organized and organic. I've got one final idea to share with you, then I'm going to press the pause button for us hopefully to have a conversation. And I'll come back to your question, Henry, once I've shared this idea. A new dynamic, calibrating, invitation, and challenge. So Jesus creates this family, this oikos, this network of relationships, this band of brothers and sisters, brothers in terms of Jesus's context, calibrating, and he relates to them by calibrating invitation and challenge. So high invitation, Jesus offers the disciples. Come and follow me. I will share the whole of my life with you. You can get as close to me as you possibly want to. He called the 12 to be with him, literally to be with him night and day. Access all areas. Be with me in my waking, walking, living, eating, sleeping life. And I will be with you to the end of the age. This is high commitment. This is high support. This is highly relational. But not only did Jesus do that, he also offered high challenge. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. He called the 12 to be with him and he sent them out to preach and drive out demons. I will be with you to the end of the age, but go into all the world and preach the gospel. High invitation and high challenge. And just some kind of big words, if you done some theological reflection or want to see how it fits together with the bigger picture. High invitation is God's covenant, God's relational covenant with us, and challenge is our kingdom responsibility. God is our Father, and we're invited into family, but our Father is also the King, and we live in obedience to his lordship. And so you might have heard the term missional community or family on mission. It combines these two ideas of invitation and challenge. That's what Jesus did. He created a family and he sent them on mission together. And this dynamic of relationships, of invitation and challenge, needs to be held in balance, just like the triangle of up, in, and out needs to be in balance. So we need invitation and challenge to be in balance. If we have high invitation, the top left-hand quadrant, but low challenge, then we create a very cozy environment. And that's perhaps typical church environment in our context, where people are invited every week. We're encouraged to belong, but we don't worry too much whether they've done anything about their walk with Jesus in betweening weeks. We're just glad that they've come back for another week to listen to another sermon, and then they'll go out again. And we're just delighted to have people come, and we make them feel very welcome, or at least I hope we do. And that's really good and proper, but we need to try and raise the level of challenge if we are to make disciples. The bottom right-hand quadrant might be familiar to you. If you've ever been in business or in a church where those in leadership are very high on challenge, it's quite stressful. It quickly can become quite discouraging because you can never match up. What we're looking for is to create that empowered culture that Jesus created, where people are both invited and challenged. And you notice how Jesus moved almost seamlessly between the two. He said to Peter, huge invitation. You are the rock on which, forget about the theological implications of this right now, you are the rock on which I will build my church. Whatever Jesus was saying, it was a huge affirmation of Peter. But just a few verses later, huge challenge for Peter. Get behind me, Satan. That idea that you've got is not of me. And so Jesus was always drawing people close, but at the same time sending them out, inviting them and challenging them. And just like with the triangle, you'll find that perhaps you're good at two and not with a third. So here, you will have a natural tendency. You'll either be good at the invitation and not so good at the challenge, or you'll be good at the challenge and not so good at the invitation. And you'll know people that fit into both camps. And the sweet spot, the empowered culture, the discipleship quadrant at top right is what we're looking for. The only problem is, it combines grace and truth, as you'd expect in the life of Jesus. We beheld his glory, full of grace, welcome, full of truth. This is how we are called to live. This is our responsibility in God's kingdom. The trouble is, you can't move from the top left quadrant to the top right quadrant without it feeling like your cozy culture is being taken away. So it feels like that. You can't move just from one side to the other without feeling like you go through the valley of the shadow of death, the dark valley of having that sense of coziness taken away. But that's the journey that probably we need to help our congregations move along. And it doesn't happen quickly. It's culture change. It happens slowly and over time, but it's a very deliberate, intentional journey that I think we need to make. Staff or church leaders usually have a different journey. Staff and church leaders are usually in that stressful quadrant. They're high on challenge, they're pushing themselves, they're pushing themselves, they're pushing themselves, they're low on support, and their journey needs to look a bit like that. Perhaps to challenge themselves a little bit less and lean into invitation a bit more, and that's the journey of church staff. Are you better at invitation or challenge? What would be the benefit in growing in the other dynamic? Okay, we're coming to the end. You're going to get all these notes, I think, sent out to you if you haven't had them already. They'll all come your way, handouts and goodness knows what, so you can have all that information there and so on, if that's of use to you. How mature do you need to be as a Christian to disciple others? You need to be one day ahead. I think we are always staggered at the speed with which Jesus discipled people. Well, he was Jesus, of course, but before we give anybody roles or responsibilities, we tend in our churches to want them to have been around for 150 years and to do this and tick that box and have done the other. And instead of releasing people, we tend to trap them. So the thing about movement and being a disciple is that as soon as you learn something, you teach it to somebody else. So I'm learning to read the Bible like this. I'm teaching someone else to read the Bible in the way that I've just learned. That's the movemental journey that we want all of us to be on. So as soon as I'm learning something, as soon as there's a gift in me, I'm sharing that gift with somebody else. So right from the get-go, we want to encourage people to be feeding into others just as a way of life, disciples that make disciples. So it's a movemental rather than a static piece. That's a very simplistic answer to your question, Henry. So feel free to come back with something else on that. Leanne's also, and that's why we also need to be part of the family of disciples for own. Absolutely, discipleship is not a solo journey. And for church leaders, if you want to know why church leaders are stressed out, they've been given a task that's impossible to disciple 50 people when Jesus could only do 12, and they've been told to do that usually by themselves. The recipe for absolute, hitting a brick wall. And that's why being in church leadership in the ways that we've expected has been really stressful and sometimes quite, well, I guess some of you on the call will have the scars to show that.